So, Heather, this week we have a lot to talk about. Of course, the UN is having a massive meeting, or had, I should say, this week about that was focused largely on climate change, highlighted by a protest that took place at the beginning of the week that were inspired by Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old girl from Sweden, and who basically took a boat across the Atlantic to draw attention to the inaction by the world leaders on a catastrophe that we are all facing as a species in many respects. The UAW strike continues. It is now almost a week old at this point, a little more, and 48,000 auto workers on strike. It's a massive strike. We may be seeing one from the Chicago teachers shortly as well. Obviously, we've got some polling in the 2020 race. Things seem to be on the move there as people start to tune into the Democratic primary. But the big news, of course, this week is that the dynamic has turned on the question of impeachment. And I think by any measure, we have now crossed the Rubicon. Nancy Pelosi came out earlier in the week, announced formal impeachment inquiry proceedings beginning. We're still looking at maybe some of what the structure is going to be, but this is really a new era for the Trump presidency, isn't it?
I think so. And, frankly, it's overdue. I think that the new era, I think a lot of us thought that new era began in January when the Democrats took over the House, and that it wouldn't take, it wouldn't take much for us to have gotten here, at least when the Mueller report was released last spring. So the fact that it's taken a while, is unfortunate, but nonetheless we are here, and it appears from what you can see just since Monday, the number of Democrats that were in favor of impeachment investigation, an official impeachment investigation, went from 134 to, at last count, as far as I know, was well over 200, perhaps over 210, with some of the holdouts, by the way, being left-wing, or I shouldn't say left-wing, but being, people you clearly are going to vote for impeachment. They're doing it for strategic reasons, to have some votes to spare there. If and when it gets to the point where they're voting on impeachment, these people can come in and be the last holdout, so that some of the swing voters, or the ones that are in moderate districts or whatever, Trump districts, if they vote for impeachment, they won't be the last ones. And I think that's just normal kind of strategizing in terms of votes and whipping the caucus. So it's actually probably much closer. So that's
in other words, just to be clear, that it's more than likely there are enough votes to impeach today, essentially, in terms of how it's committed. I mean, obviously, the Democrats want to follow a process, and part of that process, I would imagine, would be also to make the American public fully on board with this and be aware of it. But certainly, it seems highly unlikely that we're going to get to the end of this process and the House is not going to vote to impeach Donald Trump.
That's correct, and I think that's probably been there for a while. Although reporting does suggest that there were these what they call frontline freshmen who are had been sort of holding out. But over the last couple of months, there's been apparently some rethinking of that. This latest, of course, this revelation that Trump was basically blackmailing the Ukrainian president into digging up dirt or manufacturing dirt on Joe Biden. In exchange for military aid, which he was withholding at the time, which Trump was withholding at the time. The revelation of that, this whistleblower that came forward, and then the release of the memo sort of memorializing that conversation, certainly did change change the dynamics to the point where I think that Democrats finally realized that there is no avoiding it. I mean, I'm not sure I ever understood why they thought they should. They had some political reasons for that, thinking they'd lose the House or something. But it's been clear to most of us, I think, for a long time that there was no avoiding this, and not just because of this particular thing. Although it's amazing that he did this, made this call to the Ukrainian president the day after the Mueller testimony, and even mentioned the Mueller testimony in the call, saying that it was all a witch hunt, et cetera, clearly feeling liberated, believing he'd gotten away with it, and so essentially went and did exactly the same thing that he had been suspected of doing in 2016, which Mueller couldn't prove because he couldn't prove, quote, willfulness, meaning that he couldn't prove they didn't know that they knew what they were doing, and in campaign finance violations, which that apparently would have been at the time, there has to be some sense that they know what they're doing. Well, there's no excuse for that now, obviously, because Trump is the president. He's been through the full Mueller investigation. He knows very well he can't do that. That's considered unethical. But having been exonerated in his mind, he felt he could just go ahead and do this. That really is a bridge too far. And there's another aspect to this, and that is the fact that he and his henchmen in the White House counsel's office and in the Department of Justice have determined that he can also get away with total obstruction of Congress. And that is also an impeachable offense. Richard Nixon, one of the articles of impeachment against him was obstruction of Congress. So between those two things, I think that finally pushed the Democrats over the edge, and they realized that they had to take this step, and perhaps even realized that this was not as politically risky as they thought, because at some point or another you have to recognize that there were a lot of Democrats out there, 70% and growing, that wanted this. At some point, these people all had to look over their shoulder and realize, well, gee, maybe I'm losing more people than I'm gaining, right, especially in those districts, and that's a risky proposition. So, it finally came to a head. And it's still unfolding and will continue to unfold for a while. I don't think this is going to be resolved immediately, although there has been some discussion that, well, let's get this impeachment thing over with, which is ridiculous. But I don't think that can happen. There's too much. There's just too much, to deal with.
Well, let's take a break and talk about how this should go, and also let's talk about how it came about, what we anticipate. This is, I think this is an important moment for the Democrats, and it was thrust upon them, at least the leadership anyways, and they had no choice. But we will talk more about that in a moment. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Be right back with Heather Parton.